So I'm going to turn now to the Liverpool Haemophilia Centre. Liverpool's main haemophilia centre for adults was based at the Royal Liverpool Hospital. There was a small centre at the Walton Hospital, which I'll deal with separately, and then the Children's Centre at Alderhay, which I'll deal with, I think, now tomorrow morning. The adult haemophilia centre had been housed in the Liverpool Royal Infirmary, but in the late 70s it was moved to the Royal Liverpool Hospital. In terms of directors, it appears that Dr. Black was the director of the Liverpool Haemophilia Centre in the first half of the 1970s. In terms of the second half of the 1970s, sometimes the returns refer to Professor Bellingham, sometimes to Dr. Frank Bolton, sometimes to both. Dr. Bolton's own evidence, both in a short statement to the inquiry and his evidence to the Penrose inquiry, suggests that he was a consultant and centre director in Liverpool from 1975 to 1980. And we then have Dr. McVery taking over from 1980 to 1985 before he moves to Leeds. There is a period of time after Dr. McVery's departure from Liverpool where the centre didn't have a formal director. There were various documents which refer to a Dr. Mackey and Dr. Davis taking on the role of, effectively, of Haemophilia Centre Director. And there are a number of documents, and we'll come on to this, which show the HTLV3 testing and the process of patients being informed of diagnosis in that period of time from 85 to 86. Professor Hay then took over as the centre director in May of 1987 and remained in that post until November of 1994. And obviously we heard from Professor Hay in relation to that period of time when he gave oral evidence in November last year. In terms of the relationship between the adult centre at the Royal Liverpool Hospital and Alderhay, Dr. McVery's recollection was that he thought it was unlikely that the Royal Liverpool Hospital would have supplied products, whether cryo or factor VIII, to Alderhay. It thought it would have its own arrangements for supply. However, if we go to BPLL 00100612, this is a letter from Alderhay from Dr. Martin, consultant paediatrician, of whom we'll hear more tomorrow morning, February 1985 to Mr. Snape at BPL, and he says in the third line, I should say that we normally receive our factor VIII via the adult centre at the Royal Liverpool Hospital, whose director is Dr. McVery. In terms of links with other centres, the Liverpool Centre had important links with centres and hospitals treating patients in North Wales. And if we go to TREL 40311_027, this is a communication, July 1977, between the Liverpool Royal Infirmary, Dr. Bolton, and Dr. Kirk at Treloar. It refers to a patient treated at home in Wrexham. And if we pick it up in the beginning of the second paragraph, it says that the patient's not on the list of haemophiliacs registered at the Liverpool Royal Infirmary, and we do in fact cover the North/Welsh area. And then there is further evidence, I won't go to the statement, but we have a statement from Dr. David Edwards, a consultant haematologist at Gland Clwyd Hospital from 1982. He describes the arrangement being as follows, that all patients with bleeding disorders would have been registered with either Liverpool or Manchester, and the Gland Clwyd Hospital essentially offered a storage and distribution facility, so that decisions were taken in Liverpool or possibly Manchester, but patients would be able to pick up materials more locally to North Wales. There's also reference from Dr. Materials emanating from Professor Hay about patients in North Wales being jointly managed by Liverpool and haematologists, local haematologists in the North Wales area. Liverpool was not a reference centre, although it was a large centre. Manchester was the reference centre for Liverpool, but apart from occasional supra-regional meetings and Manchester undertaking some HTLV3 testing, there appear to be limited links between Liverpool and Manchester, and there doesn't appear to have been, for example, recourse from Liverpool to Manchester for advice. In terms of the relationship with the regional transfusion centre, there was a regional transfusion centre in Liverpool, sometimes called the Liverpool Regional Transfusion Centre, sometimes called the Mersey Regional Transfusion Centre. In the 70s and 80s, it would appear that the Regional Transfusion Centre provided cryoprecipitate to the Liverpool Haemophilia Centre, but the centre purchased commercial concentrates for itself. And again, we have Dr. Boulton's evidence to the Penrose inquiry, both written and oral, in which he describes having a budget of £40,000 to buy commercial factor 8. We have also a document prepared by Dr. Marklew and Dr. Shepherd, so from the Transfusion Centre, prepared in the context of the HIV litigation prepared in the context of the HIV litigation, in which they say that the needs for factor concentrates would be determined by the director of the Haemophilia Centre, and there was often a need for the centres to embark upon commercial purchases to make up the balance for use. We also have a letter from 1981 from the then director of the Regional Transfusion Centre in Liverpool, saying when they receive factor 8 from BPL, they'd simply dispatch it on to the haemophilia director, and again confirming that commercial materials were purchased by the individual hospitals. If we look, one other document emanating from the blood transfusion service at this time, it is at DHSC 301146. It's a February 1983 report from the director of the Mersey Regional Blood Transfusion Service. Perhaps interesting just to note in passing on page 4, the second paragraph, an observation about self-sufficiency. It says, for some time, self-sufficiency in blood and blood products free from any commercial persuasion has been widely advocated, and it is now NHS policy to move towards full self-sufficiency during the present decade. Apart from ethical considerations, the cost to this region of continuing to obtain these products, i.e. albumin and factor 8, from commercial sources would be substantial. So that's one perspective on self-sufficiency. If we go then to page 11, just interesting to note the declining supply of cryoprecipitate to Liverpool. So we'll see the date range is 1978 through to 1982. If we look at the item for cryoprecipitate, it's the third section down. We can see the amount issued to haemophilia centres declines markedly. So from 1978, it's 12,227. There's then a slight increase in 79 and again in 1980 to 16,355. But then it goes down in 1981 to 7,817 and down further in 1982 to 3,105. Whether that was a supply issue or a demand question is not entirely clear. Again, just looking at Liverpool broadly, the centre appears to have belonged to two regional networks. There was a regional haematologists group which met at the Mersey Regional Transfusion Centre. It seems to have involved both clinicians and transfusion blood service representatives. I'm not going to go to the document, but I invite you to note that there was a meeting of the group in November 1983. It's attended by, amongst others, Dr. McVery and Professor Bellingham. It's perhaps notable, given the date, November 1983, for the absence of any discussion at all about the issue of AIDS, or HTLV3. The second regional network was the Northwestern Supra-Regional Haemophilia Group. If we look at NHBT 00965999_043, go to the second page. If we look at the top of the page, we can see it's minutes of the Northwestern Supra-Regional Haemophilia meeting, May 1985. We go just a little further down the page. What's notable is the minutes of the last meeting. The last meeting had been held in 1980, and minutes for this were not available. So it doesn't appear as though in what might be thought to be a rather critical first half of the 1980s, this supra-regional group was having any kind of coordinated discussions. We can take that down, thank you, Shomik. In terms of facilities, in the 1970s, prior to the move to the Royal Liverpool Hospital, it appears that patients were treated on what's referred to as the Tropics ward of the Liverpool Royal Infirmary, and there are various documents which make reference to that. In terms of staffing, Dr. McVery's recollection is that there was limited staffing at the Liverpool Centre. There was no nurse or dedicated junior member of staff. Patients would be admitted to the general haematology ward. If a patient came in for factor VIII, one of the centre's experienced technicians would administer it. You may recall, sir, Professor Hayes' evidence about facilities and staffing at the Royal Liverpool Hospital at the time of his arrival in May 1987. Because we've already heard from him in some detail orally, I'm not going to repeat it to any great extent. But he referred to there being no haemophilia nurse specialists or physiotherapy input or social worker, and finding no joint clinics or multidisciplinary care. Just before we look at the annual returns, it may be useful also to look at HCDO 40342_011. This may have been a document we looked at with Professor Hay during his oral evidence, but in any event, it's May 1987, and it's him, Professor Hay, writing to Miss Spooner, who's just taken over as haemophilia director. On reviewing the patient's records, I'm left with the impression that many of our bleeders have not been registered with Oxford, and he says he'll be sending various notification forms in that respect. His recollection and his oral evidence was that over 50% of patients hadn't been registered with Oxford prior to his arrival. So turning then to the picture that emerges from the annual returns, we can pick that up in 1976 at HCDO 301093. The director is here identified as Dr. Bolton. 46 haemophilic patients treated during the year, 7 Christmas disease patients. And then if we look at the usage of different products, cryoprecipitate is given as approximately 460,000 units. So the bulk of the treatment, also a large volume of treatment through cryoprecipitate. A much smaller amount of NHS concentrate, approximately 12,500, and then 4 different commercial concentrates used, relatively small amounts of propylate, factor VIII, and haemophil, so 11,826, 1,485, 8,809 respectively, but a much larger amount of cryobilin, 365,545, and then we can see, although the numbers are not entirely clear, NHS factor IX concentrate being used for the treatment of Christmas disease. So we have here clearly from 1976 a significant amount of commercial concentrate usage. If we go to the returns for 1977, HCDO 301178, and we turn first of all to page 14, we can see this return for 1977 gives the directors as being Dr. Bolton and Professor Bellingham, 56 haemophilic patients, 8 Christmas disease patients. And then if we look at the figures, we're told approximately 800,000 units of cryoprecipitate, get a very small amount of NHS concentrate, relatively speaking, 13,000 odd units. 58,723 units of factor 8, 207,330 units of co-8, I think 83,800 units of haemophil, 94,407 units of cryobuline. So again, we can see a mix of commercial products, although still a large amount of cryoprecipitate in use. If we go to the previous page, we can see von Willebrand's patients predominantly cryoprecipitate, although a small amount of immunoproduct used. And if we go to page 9, we can see there's a specific form for home, sorry, if we just go up the page, the heading on the form, total amount of material supplied during 1977 to haemophilia A patients on home treatment. So we can see a sub-form, as it were, in relation to home treatment. We can see some cryoprecipitate being used for home treatment, but also a small amount of NHS concentrate, and then factor 8, co-8, haemophil, cryobuline being used. Important to note, however, what's said in the comments. These figures include all patients from Merseyside, including children who are normally treated by Dr. J. Martin, either at Alderhay Children's Hospital or at the Royal Liverpool Children's Hospital. Also one patient included from North Wales.
I mean, just before we leave this, we're looking here at the relative volumes of the different products being used. If we can go back to the page you were showing us a moment ago.
The main return.
The main return.
Page 14.
In the same handwriting. You'll see that the approximate conversion rate for cryoprecipitate is about 80 units per bottle. Go on to what we've just been looking at.
Page 9.
The same person appears to be using a factor of about 70.
Yes.
Which is it's all a bit slapdash.
Yes, it is. They're not entirely consistent in terms of what the precise usage then is of cryoprecipitate units. If we look at page 1 of this document, and we zoom in a little, we'll see a pretty clear indication that there appears to be no policy of adhering to one type of concentrate. So we can see from the number of ticks there are patients receiving in one calendar year factor 8 and co-8 and haemophil and cryobuline. That's 1977. If we go to 1978 at HCDO 301275, we turn to page 8. We have Professor Bellingham on this occasion given as the director. 58 patients treated during the year, 4 Christmas disease patients. And then if we look at the figures, we've got a number of bottles or bags or packs used for cryoprecipitate, not translated into units, but in any event, the figure they're given 9,500. So we may need to apply an extrapolation from the previous return. NHS concentrate 76,000. No propylate used that year. substantial quantity of factor 8, 487,544, and a not insignificant volume of co-8, just over 100,000. And then if we go to 1979, that is HCDO 301344. We can see, again, Professor Bellingham identified as director, 49 haemophilic patients treated, 5 Christmas disease patients. The purports to be a figure for cryo for the whole region, although a line through that. Cryo RLH only, 630,000 units. NHS concentrate 220,000, factor 8, 550,000, a very small amount of haemophil, 750 units, and then 150,000 units of cryobuline. And we can see reference also to DDAVP at the bottom of the page. If we go to page 3, again we can see evidence of patients being treated with more than one type of concentrate, so that we can see a number of patients treated with both factor 8 and cryobuline from the 2 ticks in that column. So again, we don't appear to see at least anything that suggests a consistent a policy of limiting exposure by using only one type of concentrate for a patient. So that's 1979. If we go to 1980, HCDO 301440. Dr. McVery is now the director, 54 haemophilia A patients, 2 von Willebrand's patients. If we look at the figures for the haemophilia A patients, we can see a significant volume of usage of cryoprecipitate in hospital, just over 1 million units, very small amount of NHS concentrate, and then a very substantial volume of ARMA product, the factor 8 product, 761,698 units in hospital, 459,442 for home treatment. Co-8 used, and we have an identical figure given both for hospital and home treatment of just over 50,490. And then the cryobuline being used, 192,000 odd in hospital, 187,500 odd for home treatment. And some of the Spaywood factor 8, also 4,000 units identified. For von Willebrand's patients, we can see it's cryoprecipitate only from the right-hand column. Again, if we look at, for example, page 4, we will see a number of patients receiving more than one type of concentrate. So if we're looking at the right-hand side of the page, there are patients receiving the ARMA product and the immuno product, a number of patients who fall within that category, although some who are only receiving cryoprecipitate or some who are receiving concentrate and cryoprecipitate. If we then move to 1981, HCDO 301542. The figures here are faint. If we go in closer, we see 50 haemophilia A patients, 1 von Willebrand's. And then if we go in as closely as we can on the right-hand side, so it looks like 331,000 odd units of cryoprecipitate in hospital, an increase in the volume of NHS concentrate, so 368,820 units in hospital, and then a substantial volume of the ARMA factor 8 used, 755,354 in hospital, and what looks like 463,756 for home treatment, a small amount of the cutter product, well, I say small, I mean 45,000 odd, The figure for cryobilin is also indistinct, but it's in the 400,000. It looks like it might be 460,977 for hospital, and I think probably also for home treatment, and then 28,000 units of the Spaywood product, Humanate, used for home treatment.
Well, this seems to be the year, so far as I can see from the figures, and depending a little bit on the accuracy of the, or reliability of the cryoprecipitate figures, this looks to be the year when there's the dramatic switch from one to the other.
Yes.
As a principal form of treatment.
Yes. Yes. In 1981, we can see concentrate predominates.
Yeah. Well, very much so.
And it's commercial concentrate predominating.
Yeah.
And if we go to page 4, again, this is just one page of a list of pages giving details of individual treatments. But again, we can see patients being treated on a number of patients being treated with more than one type of concentrate. And a similar pattern emerges on other pages. That's not true for all patients, but certainly true for some of them. 1982, we go to HCDO 301640. 48 patients with haemophilia A, no von Willebrand's treated. We can see, again, a marked decline in the usage of cryoprecipitate, 29,260 units in hospital. A significant increase in the use of NHS concentrate, 861,000 plus in hospital, 295,000 odd for home treatment. But the predominant treatment, again, is with commercial concentrates, in particular the Armour product, Factor 8, just over 1 million units used in hospital and just under 750,000 units for home treatment. A smaller but not insignificant volume used of the Co-8 product, so 106,800 in hospital, 94,500 for home treatment, and a significant volume of the Immuno product used in both hospital and home treatment, 333,377 units in hospital, 327,637 units for home treatment. And if we go to page 5, again, we can see if we zoom in, thank you, a number of patients receiving more than one type of concentrate. So there are patients receiving, for example, both Elstree, so NHS Factor 8 and Armour. There are patients receiving Elstree, Armour and Immuno. There's a patient receiving Elstree, Armour, Cutter and Immuno, and so on. So again, a fairly clear indication that there's no policy of keeping patients on one particular brand of concentrate. 1983, we need to go to HCDO 40145_003. We go to the second page. We can see 48 haemophilia A patients, 1 von Willebrand's. The latter is treated with NHS concentrate. There is here getting rather more NHS concentrate used than previously, so a relatively modest amount of cryoprecipitate, 17,780. 1.2 million units of NHS concentrate in hospital, just 722,000 plus in home treatment, and then significant volume of the Armour product, Factor 8, 945,880 units hospital, 667,160 for home treatment, and of Co-8, an identical figure given for both hospital and home, 181,740. So although there's a significant increase in the use of NHS concentrate, again, in terms of overall figures, I haven't done a precise calculation, but the commercial concentrates, I think, are still predominating, although perhaps not by much at that point. And then we go to 1984, which is HCDO 301832. "45 haemophilia A patients." This is the first year we see more NHS concentrate being used than commercial concentrate, although the volume of commercial concentrate usage is still high. Very limited cryoprecipitate usage, just over 6,000. 1.3 million units of NHS in hospital, 914 plus units for home treatment. A smaller amount of the alpha product, Profilate, 8,000 given for both hospital and home. The Armour product, 760,000 hospital, 711,600 for home treatment. And then, again, somewhat curiously, the same volume given for the cutters, for the COAT, 150,340 hospital and home treatment. The fact that the same figures appear for both hospital and home might give rise to a question of to whether this is accurate, because it does seem perhaps a little implausible that we would see precisely the same figures appearing on a number of occasions as we have here. In any event, that's 1984. The 1985 returns a bit of a mess. HCDO 301925. Looks like this has been completed by Dr. Mackey, because in the course of 85, Dr. McVery has left. 46 haemophilia A patients treated. And then, if we look closer, we can see, and again, there'll have been a switch to heat-treated product, presumably at some point in the course of 1985. That figures for NHS Concentrate Hospital, 1.237 million. And then it's not entirely clear what the breakdown is. Maybe that's a total figure, in fact, I think. And then we have it subdivided, despite where it appears in the form, into H, home treatment, 640,700, hospital treatment, 372,000 odd. And so we see NHS concentrate being used and a not dissimilar volume of the Armour factor 8 being used, and then a smaller amount of haemophil cryobuline and humanate being used. There's also a reference towards the bottom of the page to a fairly significant volume being sent to other hospitals, but what that's a reference to is unclear. The other data that we have in relation to product usage, although it doesn't give the complete picture, are some stock record cards. I'll just look at one example, LUHT 602. We can see these are, this is 1980, and we can see these appear to be monthly breakdowns of the amount, excuse me, of different products used. We don't have a complete set of these, but they may have been what was used to compile the annual returns. We don't know. In terms of other information relating to treatment policies, we have some evidence from Dr. Boulton. Hopefully we'll in due course have rather more direct evidence to the inquiry from Dr. Boulton. But he talks about, in his evidence to the Penrose inquiry, he talks about cryoprecipitate being messy to deal with. He says he did use it in Liverpool, and he thought it was very difficult for home therapy. It was more cumbersome for patients. But as I say, we may hear more from Dr. Boulton in due course. Dr. McVery's statements, I'm not going to go to the statements themselves, but I can, I think, pull out some of the issues that arise from his statements. He recalls consulting Dr. Peter Jones in Newcastle before choosing what products to prescribe. And he recalls Dr. Jones having transferred his patients to commercial factor 8 to address the lack of NHS material. And Dr. McVery says, based on Dr. Jones's experience, I was encouraged to switch to commercial factor 8 for two reasons. first of all, availability and reliability of supply. And second, he says there was a mood at that time to continue using a particular product in an individual patient, as this may reduce the prevalence of factor antibodies arising. The evidence that we've looked at in the returns doesn't, however, bear out that that was the approach that was taken. Dr. McVerry also seemed to recall the UK HCDO thinking that a number of commercial companies should be used for commercial factors rather than reliance upon one preferred supplier. He does not appear to have been a fan of cryoprecipitate. He can't recall giving it to a patient in Liverpool, although it obviously was used in the first half of the 80s. He says, in his view, cryoprecipitate couldn't be safely undertaken at home, and the received wisdom at the time was that home treatment was better for all patients. He suggests that for mild haemophilia, the general approach would have been DDAVP. He doesn't recall many previously untreated patients or pups, but says the general approach would have been treat with DDAVP. If that wasn't viable, then cryo or factor VIII only in the case of an emergency. And then his recollection is that there was a switch to heat-treated product when it became available in around early 1985. There are two documents, however, which give the perspective of two other clinicians on the approach at Liverpool. The first is a document that we think was prepared by Professor Hay in the context of the HIV litigation. So if we go to NHBT 0085908, you can see it's response to questionnaire HIV litigation main statement of claim, and it's apparent from the context that it's Professor Hay, because it says, second paragraph, having taken up post in May of 1987, I'm unable to answer some of the questions and suggest you direct them to Dr. McVerry. If we go to page 8. This appears to be Professor Hayes' perspective, having come in from 87, as to what had happened prior to his arrival. So if we go further down the page, we can see, it says, I started to use heat-treated factor VIII in November 1984 in Sheffield. Unheated factor VIII was used in Liverpool until the summer/autumn of 1985. So that was his understanding of the position in Liverpool. And then the next paragraph, all patients were treated with whichever material was available. No cohorts were treated with any specific product. Many centres treated children with cryo and reserved domestic concentrate for children to defer the onset of hepatitis. We go to page 10. Top of the page, picking it up in the second line, patients were treated with what was available and were not reserved particular products or batches, as was the practice in some centres. There was no pattern of use, and this did not change. All factor VIII used prior to mid-1985 was untreated, and after that all was heat-treated. In my opinion, insufficient use of cryo was made in this centre. Children and mild haemophiliacs should have been treated preferentially with cryo and possibly domestic concentrate. Advice on treatment of adults and children was the same in this centre. In many centres, children are treated with cryo for as long as possible to delay the onset of non-A, non-B hepatitis. I can find no documentation of advice from my predecessor regarding the use of blood products. I do know that DDAVP was used less here than in other centres. And then, if we go to page 12, no, sorry, if we go to page 14, my apologies. Bottom of the page, again, we can see in the paragraph, the penultimate paragraph, it says, I started to use heat-treated factor VIII. So that's Professor Hay talking about Sheffield. This did not happen in Liverpool until autumn 1985 when UK heat-treated 8 became available. And then bottom of the next page, he discusses DDAVP being available in 1977, and then picking up in the last few lines, in those centres enthusiastic about it, its use has not changed in recent years. It's my impression that it should have been used more in this centre in the early 1980s. Its use was widespread from 1977. So that's Dr. Hayes' perspective, as I think, given what would have been the likely date of this, the then Haemophilia Centre Director in Liverpool, looking back at what he had gleaned about the early 1980s. There's then a report from Dr. Ludlum on the case of an individual patient treated at Liverpool. It is DHSC 004364_074. It's dated April 92, and it's a draft report by Dr. Ludlum. It's on a specific patient. If we go to, just again, really to pick up what we learned from it about overall policies and practices in Liverpool, we can see, perhaps to provide some context, bottom half of page 4, there's a various treatments are described, and the latest one being January of 1983, and then Dr. Ludlum observing it appears that this particular patient was not reviewed at the Royal Liverpool Hospital again until 1987, when the patient was found to be HIV positive, and there's reference to use of the Armour product in 1986. If we go to page 6, there's then a series of questions posed by Dr. Ludlum, picking it up in the 4th line. It is not clear why the decision was made to treat him with factor VIII concentrate on the 1st of January 1981. Had the supply of cryoprecipitate run out over the Christmas period? To defend the use of commercial factor VIII concentrate in January 1981, it would be necessary to demonstrate that cryoprecipitate was ineffective therapy or unavailable despite repeated requests to the Regional Blood Transfusion Centre. And in this instance, NHS factor VIII concentrate would be the next preferred option. Again, it would be necessary to demonstrate that NHS concentrate was unavailable. Therefore, it would only be justified to use commercial concentrate if the other two forms of treatment were unavailable. And then if we go to the next page, he says, Dr. McVerry, in his evidence, it's not clear what evidence that refers to, perhaps some information sought from Dr. McVerry in the context of the HIV litigation, states that cryoprecipitate was not available after 1980. It would really be very useful to know what attempts he'd made to secure a reasonable supply of it. Although he does not distinguish between the perceived side effects of NHS compared to commercial factor VIII concentrates, there were many in the UK in the early 1980s who considered NHS factor VIII to be safer than that supplied by commercial manufacturers with respect to hepatitis. His view, that's Dr. McVerry's view, may in part have been due to working in the United States where only commercial concentrates were available. So that's a bit of additional information about what appears to have been the approach taken in the 1980s in Liverpool. And there are then two other documents from the HIV litigation relevant to understanding policies and approach to treatment in Liverpool. If we go first of all to DHSC 0045373118, these are and it's dated July 91. It's called a status report on medical negligence cases. And it refers to a range of cases from different centres. But in terms of Liverpool, we go to page 21. We pick it up. Well, we can see it's a Haemophilia B patient. And then if we pick it up in the second paragraph, according to the statement of claim, the plaintiff was told by Dr. McVery in January 85 that the NHS factor 9 which he was receiving was not heat treated, in contrast to factor 8, because it was perfectly safe. If so, there is of course no record in the notes of this conversation. It must be accepted that this was an unjustified prediction in the then state of knowledge. In fact, the first seroconversion of a Haemophilia B patient receiving NHS factor 9 concentrate was recorded in the following month. Although the risks of HIV infection from factor 9 concentrate appeared to be lower than those from factor 8, and although this country was self-sufficient in home-produced factor 9 concentrate, which could reasonably be expected to be safer than unheated imported material, it was certainly not justifiable to state that no risk attached to the use of unheated NHS factor 9 concentrate. And then, if we just go a little further down the page, the author of this document, we don't know who that was, says that if he, that's the plaintiff, had been warned of even a slight risk from the use of unheated material in January 85, he might well have opted to revert to the use of fresh frozen plasma or of heat-treated imported concentrate. So that's one document looking at, again, what's said to have been the approach of Dr. McVery to treatment of a patient with haemophilia B. And then if we go to DHSC 00457721_051, there are a handful of cases. So this is another status report from September 1991. There are two Liverpool cases discussed. The first is on the first page. It's the one referred to as JKP 014. Adult pleaded as mild haemophiliac according to Dr. McVery. Severe haemophiliac had been undertreated in the past. Now deceased, treated with cryoprecipitate until 1982, then had a knee operation under cover of NHS concentrate, followed by home treatment in April 1983. Reason for this was because he was having problems with his left ankle. According to Dr. McVery, this was necessary on clinical grounds. Dr. McVery considers this case is defendable. Date of seroconversion remains unclear, but on the balance of probabilities, this was as a result of infection with commercial product given during home treatment. It's intended to seek independent expert opinion on the merits of the defence. And the second Liverpool case is the bottom of...
Just as a matter of interest in that, if you just go back up to the top of the page. The third sentence under JKP 014 is treated with cryoprecipitate until 1982. The earlier reference to what Dr. McVery was saying was you couldn't get cryoprecipitate after 1980.
Absolutely right, sir. Yes. And then if we go to the bottom of page 3, the patient referred to as JKP 43, we know is also a Liverpool case, mild haemophiliac adult. He received cryoprecipitate until the beginning of 1981, same point then arises, sir. And then there's a reference to being given factor 8 concentrate. Picking it up halfway down that long paragraph, it's not known when he seroconverted because he didn't attend hospital for several years thereafter, and his first positive test was in 1987. Maybe the same case that Dr. Ludlum was considering, but not necessarily. Dr. McVery comments that no specific priority was given to mild haemophiliacs for treatment with NHS product at the time. And again, a reference to obtaining independent expert evidence. So, although it's not directly from Dr. McVery, it's the author of this report recording what they understand Dr. McVery's comments to have been. If correctly reported, that would suggest no particular policy in relation to the treatment of mild haemophiliacs.
And the comment at the end, the last sentence.
yes, necessary to obtain independent expert evidence as to whether this case is defendable.
It looks from what is being said that the view of the author of this is that it probably isn't.
Yes. So note the time. What I just want to do is just deal with a couple of other aspects of evidence received by the inquiry. But I've still got quite a lot I'd like to cover in relation to Liverpool, which is not going to be done within a short period of time. So if I can just do the next few observations arising out of witness statement evidence from patients and their families, and then pick up Liverpool in the morning.
Yes.
And I'll deal with the knock-on consequences in terms of other centres after I've done that. So in terms of evidence the inquiry has received from patients, I'm not going to go to the statements themselves, but we have received several statements from patients with mild haemophilia A who were treated with factor concentrates at Liverpool in the first half of the 1980s. There is one witness, for example, who describes being given factor VIII in 1982, a patient with mild haemophilia A, and said there was a complete failure by the Royal Liverpool Hospital to mention any risk factors in relation to the use of blood products. We were told factor VIII was safer, less bulky, easy to store and easier to use than cryoprecipitate. We were also told it could be used for home treatment and taken on our holidays, so that it was overall a much more convenient way to be treated. Finally, we were told that everyone's treatment was being switched to factor VIII, and that's a witness who's given oral evidence to the inquiry. There's also a statement from the widow of a patient with haemophilia B. This may be one of the cases that we've looked at in the documents a few minutes ago. That witness describes her husband asking several times if the factor IX treatment was heat treated and being told it was. In early 1985, and this is her recollection, her husband was specifically told by the nurse under instruction from Dr. McVery that factor IX, unlike factor VIII, was from the UK, not the USA, and had been heat treated and was therefore safe to inject without fear of infection. Without going back then to the evidence that Professor Hay gave to the inquiry orally, you may recall his evidence of his impression was that there hadn't been much use of cryoprecipitate prior to his arrival in Liverpool, and he didn't observe any written policies in place in relation to approaches to treatment. So the next topic I'm proposing to deal with is knowledge of risk of hepatitis and HIV, and there are a number of documents I want to go to in relation to that. So if we could pick that up tomorrow morning.
Yes, well, let's do that at 10 o'clock, shall we?
Yes, in terms of the centres that I would then aim to cover tomorrow, and acknowledging realistically that I've not covered as many centres as I would have hoped to cover today, but I think it's important not to rush through centres. I would propose to complete the Royal Liverpool Hospital. I can deal very briefly with the Walton Hospital because there's very little information. And then deal with Alderhay, about which there's a considerable amount of evidence. And then I will then deal with the centres I mentioned this morning, but not the London one. So I'll deal with, not probably in this order, the three Scottish centres, Bristol, Truro, Southampton, Cambridge and Norwich and Norfolk tomorrow, I hope. But there were 10 London centres that we have provided written notes of that I was hoping to get to tomorrow, but which realistically I won't. There are still 3 further London centres which we're investigating, and so I think it might be more convenient and fairer to all concerned if the London centres are then looked at as a composite whole as a later date when we then pick up all the remaining haemophilia centres.
Well, I think that sounds very sensible. I have in mind that people who are watching may have a particular interest in 1 or 2 centres only, quite apart from the general issues which some of the questions and answers and presentations have thrown up. And if so, it's important not to skim over them in a way which might, if you were trying to fit a proper presentation into a shorter period of time.
Exactly.
So let's do it as you suggest.
Thank
and
you,
we'll
sir.
find time one way or the other without adding to the overall period of time we take later on.
Thank you.
So it's 10 o'clock tomorrow.